The silence in the classroom was almost palpable. All eyes were fixed on the teacher, a man known for his relentless skepticism and for the way he challenged anyone who dared to defend the Christian faith in his territory. He moved around the room, his sharp gaze assessing the students like a predator surveying its prey. With a calculated smile, he posed the question that had dismantled countless arguments before that one. If God is real, why does evil exist? The room remained silent for a few seconds. The students were accustomed to that spectacle. Many had already seen classmates attempt to respond, only to be taken apart one by the teacher's keen reasoning. He was a master in the art of turning any believer's answer into proof against their own faith. Suffering exists. Tragedies happen. Innocents die every day. If God is so good, why does he do nothing? He continued, his voice laced with irony. Some students offered discreet smiles, others simply looked down, avoiding being called to the debate. But then a hand was raised at the back of the room. It was a quiet student known for his intelligence, yet one who rarely spoke. His calm demeanor contrasted with the tension in the room. The teacher raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Finally," said the teacher, crossing his arms, "someone volunteered to be refuted." The student remained composed. His gaze was steady, without any sign of nervousness. He took a deep breath and said, "You are asking why God allows evil, but that is not the right question." The teacher smiled slyly. Then enlighten me. What would be the right question?" The student leaned slightly forward, his voice firm and controlled. "The right question is not why God allows evil. The right question is, how do human beings deal with evil?" The room grew even quieter. The teacher narrowed his eyes. "You are trying to avoid the issue," he accused. "I'm not. I'm merely pointing out that you start from a wrong premise," the student replied. "You assume that God should intervene every time something bad happens. But if he did that, what kind of world would we have?" The teacher smiled, as if he had truly been challenged for the first time in a long while. "So you believe that God lets us suffer so that we can learn something?" The student shook his head. "It's not that he lets us suffer. Suffering exists because we live in a world where choices matter. If God prevented all bad consequences, would we really be choosing anything? Or would we just be following a script without any real freedom?" The teacher began pacing the room, processing the response. "So you're telling me that free will justifies all suffering? Do children die of hunger because someone chose it? Is a natural disaster anyone's fault?" The student looked at him without hesitation. "Suffering is not just a consequence of our choices. It is part of the reality that reminds us of something greater." The teacher laughed. "Something greater. So pain and tragedy are, in some way, good." The student folded his hands on the table. "No. They are painful, terrible. But ask anyone who has gone through a difficult moment and come out stronger. Ask someone who faced loss and learned to value life more. Suffering is not good, but it can transform us." The room was completely absorbed. The students who had been smiling earlier were now fully attentive. Even those who were not religious were engrossed in the debate. The teacher narrowed his eyes. "That still doesn't prove that God exists." The student nodded. "Not everything can be proven the way you want. But let me ask you a question. Do you believe in love?" The teacher blinked, surprised by the change in direction. "What does that have to do with what we're discussing?" "Just answer," the student insisted. The teacher snorted. "Yes, of course I do." The student tilted his head. "Prove it." The teacher crossed his arms. "Love is something we feel, something we experience." "Exactly," replied the student. "You believe because you see its evidence in the world. You can't put it in a test tube nor measure it with scientific precision, but you know it exists because you see its manifestations." The teacher frowned. "What's your point?" The student looked him in the eyes. "The same applies to God. I cannot show him in an equation, but I see his evidence in the way people live, in sacrifice, in forgiveness, in compassion. You see chaos. I see purpose." The room fell silent once again. The teacher opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate counter-argument. Before he could say anything, the bell rang. The students began gathering their materials, but the atmosphere seemed different. The spectacle of the teachers' debates, which always ended with a triumphant skeptic, this time did not conclude as expected. The students stood up and left without haste, without a triumphant smile or any celebration. He wasn't there to win. He was there to make people think. And judging by the teacher's expression, he had succeeded. Night had already fallen when Warren arrived at his office. He threw his briefcase onto the table and sat down, exhausted. But no matter how hard he tried to push the thoughts away, the student's words still echoed in his mind. He looked at the bookshelf filled with books, philosophy, science, history. All the arguments he had used for years to refute faith were there. And yet, he felt uneasy. He got up and picked a random book. He flipped through the pages without really reading them. "Do you believe in love? Prove it," he murmured, repeating the student's words. He abruptly closed the book. The issue wasn't just logical. It was something deeper, something that couldn't simply be dismantled in a debate. It was something personal. For the first time in a long while, he felt he didn't have all the answers. He got up and went to the window. The campus was lit by streetlights. Students still walked along the sidewalks, discussing, laughing, living their lives. He wondered if anyone else in that room had been impacted by the discussion. He himself had been. But to admit that? Never. Or at least, that's what he thought. Days later. The next class arrived sooner than he expected. Professor Warren entered the room and found his students talking, but the atmosphere was different. There was no lightness and ease that usually accompanied his classes. There was something unsaid in the air. He looked to the back of the room and saw the same student from before, sitting calmly, as if nothing had happened. But Warren knew that something had changed. He took a deep breath and approached the podium. "All right, folks, today—" He hesitated for a moment. The students noticed. Warren never hesitated. He cleared his throat and tried to regain his composure. "Today I want to continue the discussion from our last class." Silence filled the room. "But this time I want everyone to participate." The students exchanged glances. "I want to hear what you think," he continued. "Not just about what I say, but about what you believe." Jessica raised her hand. "And you, Professor?" Warren blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" She studied him for a moment. "You always have answers for everything. But have you ever wondered if any of them might be wrong?" He opened his mouth to respond, but then closed it. The students waited. Finally, he let out a small sigh. "Perhaps." Jessica smiled slightly. The student at the back of the room observed in silence. Warren crossed his arms, but his gaze no longer held that gleam of absolute certainty. He looked directly at the student who had challenged him days before. "Do you really believe that all of this makes sense?" The student remained calm. "I believe there is meaning, even in questions that still have no answer." The teacher studied him for a moment, weighing every word. "And what do you gain from it?" The student smiled faintly. "Peace." The answer was simple, but it struck Warren in an unexpected way. "Peace," he repeated. "Yes," the student replied. "Knowing that there is something greater, that pain is not the end, that suffering has a purpose, even when we do not understand it." The teacher frowned. "And if you're wrong?" The student leaned slightly forward. "And if you are?" The room fell completely silent. For the first time, there was no winner in the debate. There was no teacher crushing a student with cold logic. There was only a room full of people thinking, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was the beginning of something greater.